They called him the Broken King, an alpha no woman would desire. They called her the family ghost, a creature to be hidden away in shame. They never imagined his gaze would pierce the shadows and find her, or that with a single word, he would shatter their world. But what happens when a forgotten girl is claimed by a crippled king? The answer will change everything. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The lock clicked with a sound of finality, a sharp, metallic punctuation to a lifetime of being cast aside. Selene Hart stood in the center of the small, dusty room, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer, though she had long forgotten who to pray to. The only window was a high, narrow slit near the ceiling, its iron bars thick and rusted, offering not a view, but a sliver of bruised purple evening sky. From beyond the heavy oak door, the sounds of the mating ceremony, the most important event of the decade, bled through in a muffled wave of string music and distant, joyous laughter. It was a world away, a world she was not permitted to inhabit. Her stepmother, Lady Alara, stood on the other side of the door, her voice a blade of ice even when muffled by the wood. "You will remain here until the ceremony is over," she had declared moments before, her eyes, the color of winter frost, raking over Selene with undisguised contempt. "I will not have you parading your frail and sickly appearance before the Alpha King. The Hart name has already endured enough whispers because of you." Briar and Thorn, her stepsisters, had flanked Alara like a pair of preening vultures. Their gowns, one in emerald silk and the other in sapphire velvet, were a riot of color and expense that made Selene's simple, gray linen dress seem even more pathetic. "Don't worry, little sister," Briar had sneered, her lips curling. "No one will even notice you're gone. They never do." "She's the ghost of the family," Thorn added with a cruel giggle, adjusting a diamond pin in her elaborate hairstyle. "It's better she stays with the other forgotten things in the attic." Selene's plea had been a whisper, a fragile thing in the face of their granite cruelty. "I wouldn't," she had promised, her voice trembling slightly. "I wouldn't cause any trouble. I just don't want to be locked away." It wasn't the ceremony she yearned for, not the pageantry or the chance to be chosen. It was the simple freedom of not being caged, of not being treated like a shameful secret. Her pleas were met with a cold, echoing silence before the bolt was thrown. Now, alone, the weight of their words settled upon her. Frail, sickly, a ghost. She had been an afterthought for as long as she could remember, a pale shadow in the vibrant, boisterous life of the Hart estate. But this was a new level of cruelty. This was not neglect. It was a deliberate, calculated act of erasure. A profound sense of isolation washed over her, so complete and suffocating it felt like drowning. She was worthless, and her own family had just bolted the door on that fact. For the better part of an hour, Selene did nothing. She stood in the suffocating silence, letting the dust motes dance in the single fading beam of twilight from the high window. The muffled music from the great hall was a constant, mocking reminder of her exclusion. But then, something shifted within her. A tiny, hot spark ignited in the cold emptiness of her chest. It was a spark of defiance, unfamiliar and yet fiercely welcome. She would not simply accept this. She would not be erased. Her eyes scanned the small, prison-like room, and a memory surfaced. A secret she had nurtured for years. With newfound purpose, she knelt on the grimy floor, her fingers tracing the edges of the floorboards near the wall. Her nails dug into a small crack, and she pulled. The wood groaned in protest. It was a loose board, a secret discovered during a lonely childhood spent exploring the forgotten corners of the estate. With a surge of adrenaline, she pried it open, the screech of old nails loud in the quiet room. Beneath it lay not dirt, but a dark, narrow void. It was a servant's passage, long forgotten, a network of arteries running through the stone walls of the house. The air that wafted up was stale, smelling of stone dust and slumbering spiders. Fear coiled in her stomach, a cold, slithering thing. But the defiance burned hotter. This was the boldest thing she had ever done. A rebellion against a life of being invisible. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Selene squeezed her slight frame into the opening, lowering herself into the pitch-black unknown. The passage was tight, the rough stone scraping against her shoulders. Guided only by the increasing volume of the music and the faint vibration traveling through the manor's bones, she began to make her way towards the great hall. The passage was a claustrophobic nightmare of cobwebs and shadows, but with every step, Selene felt a thrilling sense of empowerment. She was no longer a prisoner in a locked room, but a secret observer, moving unseen through the heart of her own home. She followed the sound until it was a symphony of strings and laughter directly to her left. Her searching hands found a small, grated opening at eye level, a ventilation shaft long since disused. Peering through the iron latticework, she found she had a perfect shadowed vantage point over the entire grand hall. The sight stole her breath. The hall was a masterpiece of opulence, transformed from its usual stern grandeur into a veritable fairy tale. Garlands of white roses and ivy were draped from the high vaulted ceilings, and thousands of candles burned in massive iron chandeliers, their light glinting off the polished marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of wax, flowers, and expensive perfume. Below, a sea of lavishly dressed women and powerful alphas mingled. The women were like exotic birds, adorned in silks and satins of every conceivable color, their necks and wrists dripping with jewels. The alphas stood like proud stags, their broad shoulders and confident postures radiating an aura of power and authority. A pang of longing struck Selene, so sharp and sudden it was a physical ache. It wasn't for the glittering gowns or the attention of the alphas. It was for the sense of belonging, for the easy way they laughed and talked, for the simple human connection that she had always been denied. From her hiding place, she was a ghost observing the living, a creature of dust and shadows, gazing upon a world of light and color. Then a hush fell over the hall. The music faltered and died, the chatter ceased, and a palpable tension, thick with expectation, filled the air. Every head turned towards the grand entrance. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorne had arrived. He was a stark, brutal contrast to the polished, preening alphas who filled the hall. The whispers that had rippled through the crowd before his entrance now became a low, shocked murmur. He was not what they expected, not what they hoped for. War had carved its story onto his body. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his eye and giving him a permanent, grim cast. He walked with a pronounced, agonizing limp, his right leg dragging slightly, a constant reminder of a wound that had nearly claimed his life. His eyes, a startlingly deep shade of cobalt blue, held no regal fire, only a deep, weary sadness that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. The crowd's reaction was a wave of revulsion, thinly veiled as pity. They saw a broken king, a damaged prize. Whispers slithered through the hall like snakes in the grass. He's a cripple, and what woman would want a mate so scarred? And our kingdom is led by a ruin. The pity and disgust were so thick Selene could almost taste them. But as she looked at the lonely, imposing figure moving with a heavy dignity through the sea of judgment, she felt no revulsion. Instead, a strange, inexplicable sense of connection resonated within her. She, who had been called frail and weak her whole life, looked at his visible pain and saw not brokenness, but a strength that defied it. She saw the immense willpower it must take to simply walk across that room, to stand before them all, bearing the weight of their disappointment. King Adrian reached the throne and stood before it, not taking a seat. His gaze, heavy and dismissive, swept over the crowd of hopeful mates. He saw the practiced smiles, the ambitious glint in their eyes, the way they presented themselves like offerings at a market. One by one, the beautiful, perfect women of the kingdom's most powerful families met his eyes, their smiles faltering under the weight of his profound indifference. He saw nothing there for him. His gaze continued its sweep, past the glittering assembly, past the lords and ladies, past the very edge of the celebration. It traveled upwards, along the stone walls, as if drawn by some unseen, undeniable force, and then it stopped. His cobalt eyes, full of ancient pain, locked directly onto the small, grated opening in the wall. Onto her. The world seemed to fall away, the music, the whispers, the glittering crowd, all of it dissolved into a meaningless blur. For a heart-stopping moment, it was as if they were the only two people in existence, a king in his broken glory and a forgotten girl in her dusty hiding place. Selene's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He couldn't see her. It was impossible. She was hidden. She was a shadow. But he did see her. His gaze pierced the darkness, seeing past the iron grate and into the soul of the girl hiding behind it. Then he raised a hand, his scarred fingers pointing directly at her. A collective gasp swept the hall. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, like stones grinding together, yet it carried an undeniable authority that cut through the stunned silence. "Her," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, echoing in the sudden stillness of the grand hall. "The one in the shadows. She is my choice." The world tilted on its axis. Shock, then outrage, erupted from the crowd below. But for Selene, pressed against the cold stone of the passage, there was only a dizzying, terrifying mix of emotions, a maelstrom of pure terror, and a strange, unfamiliar, and utterly overwhelming feeling of being truly, completely seen. For a moment, the world was a vortex of noise and disbelief. 1,000 gasps sucked the air from the hall, followed by an explosion of furious, scandalized whispers. Men gripped the hilts of their swords. Women clutched at their pearls, their faces a gallery of outrage. But up in the suffocating darkness of the servants' passage, Selene heard none of it. The world had narrowed to the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart and the impossible, unwavering stare of the Alpha King. His eyes, those chips of cobalt ice, held her pinned, a butterfly to a board. He saw her, he had pointed at her, he had chosen her. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled backwards, away from the grate, her hands flailing in the dark, dusty air. She had to run, to disappear back into the obscurity that had been her only shield. But there was nowhere to go. Below, the chaos was given direction. "The grate!" someone shouted. He's pointing at the ventilation grate in the west wall. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed from the hall. "Find her!" a voice commanded, likely the captain of the royal guard. "Search the passages." Selene's breath came in ragged, shallow sobs. She was trapped. The passage that had been her escape was now her cage. She could hear them coming, their armored boots clanging against stone, their voices drawing nearer. A rough hand suddenly grabbed her arm, and she cried out, a small, terrified sound. A guard, his face grim in the flickering torchlight that now flooded the passage, pulled her from her hiding place. "Come on, you," he grunted, not unkindly, but with an impatient force that brooked no argument. They half-dragged, half-carried her through the labyrinthine corridors she had just navigated with such defiant hope. The hope was gone now, replaced by a chilling, bone-deep dread. She was thrust from the darkness of the passage into the blinding light of the great hall. The sudden brilliance of 1,000 candles made her flinch, and she threw a hand up to shield her eyes. When she lowered it, she was met with a sea of hostile, incredulous faces. The music was dead. The laughter was gone. There was only a vast, ringing silence, punctuated by the collective stare of the entire kingdom's nobility. She stood there, a creature of dust and shadows, her simple gray dress smudged with grime, her hair a mess of loose strands, her face pale with terror. She was a stray cat dragged into a ballroom. A strangled gasp came from the crowd, and Lady Alara pushed her way forward, her face a mask of pure horror. Her stepsisters, Briar and Thorn, followed in her wake, their expressions a mixture of shock and malicious glee. This was a humiliation beyond their wildest dreams. "Your Majesty," Alara began, her voice trembling with a desperate attempt at composure as she curtsied low before the king. She didn't even glance at Selene, refusing to acknowledge her presence. There must be some mistake. A terrible, unfortunate mistake. This is just a servant girl who has lost her way. She is simple-minded and prone to wandering. I shall have her whipped and dismissed at once. She will not trouble you again." She made a move to grab Selene, to physically shove her back into the shadows where she belonged. But Adrian's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "I know what I saw," he said, his gaze never leaving Selene's face. And I know, my fated mate. The words, spoken with such calm certainty, were a death knell to Alara's desperate lies. The color drained from her face, leaving it a mottled, sickly white. The whispers in the crowd shifted, the scorn that had been directed at Selene now turning like a pack of wolves upon the Hart family. Then the king moved. He descended the 2 steps from the dais, and every eye in the hall followed him. The sound of his uneven footsteps was unnervingly loud on the polished marble floor, a rhythmic limp that was a testament to his pain and his power. He did not try to hide it. He moved with a deliberate, inexorable purpose, his eyes fixed on Selene as if she were the only person in the room. The crowd parted before him like the sea before a prophet. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the way the scar tissue pulled at his skin. He was even more imposing up close, a mountain of a man, yet the weariness in his gaze was so profound it made her own fear recede, replaced by a strange, aching empathy. He raised his hand, the one that wasn't scarred, and gently he took hers. The moment his skin touched hers, a jolt, potent and undeniable, shot up her arm. It was not a shock of static, but a wave of pure, liquid warmth, a current of energy that felt like coming home after a lifetime in the cold. It quieted the frantic beating of her heart, pushed back the terror, and filled her with a dizzying sense of recognition, as if a part of her soul she never knew was missing had just clicked into place. Her terror, which had been a roaring inferno, gave way to a dawning, fragile sense of wonder. The world was spinning into madness. Her family was staring at her with murder in their eyes. But this man's hand, firm and warm around her own, was the only solid thing in the universe. Adrian led her away from the gawking assembly, his grip a silent promise of protection. Royal guards, their faces impassive stone, formed a perimeter around them, escorting them from the great hall and into the labyrinthine corridors of the royal palace. The journey to the royal quarters was a blur of gilded frames, intricate tapestries, and the cold, judgmental stares of courtiers who lined the halls like statues. The whispers followed them, a persistent, venomous hiss. A Hart? I thought they only had 2 daughters. Look at her dress. She looks like a scullery maid. The king is truly mad. He has chosen a nobody, a ghost. The council will never accept this. It's a scandal. Each whispered word was a tiny, sharp stone thrown at her. Selene kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the worn leather of her shoes a stark contrast to the plush crimson runners that carpeted the palace. She felt like an imposter, a fraud who had stumbled into a life that was not her own. The initial wonder she had felt at the king's touch was rapidly being buried under an avalanche of anxiety and crushing self-doubt. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was a nightmare. She had been seen, yes, but now she was being judged by an entire world she did not understand. The weight of her new reality, a reality she had never asked for, began to press down on her, suffocating her. They finally arrived at a set of massive, ornately carved doors. The guards opened them to reveal the royal quarters. The rooms were vast and imposing, filled with furniture of dark, polished wood, heavy velvet curtains, and shelves laden with priceless artifacts. It was a world of unimaginable luxury, and it only made Selene feel smaller, more insignificant. She was a field mouse in a lion's den. Adrian finally spoke, his voice low and directed at the hovering attendants. "Leave us." The command was quiet, but it held an absolute authority. The servants and courtiers bowed low and scurried out, closing the heavy doors behind them, plunging the room into a sudden, profound silence. For the first time, they were truly alone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Selene stood frozen just inside the door, her hands twisting the fabric of her worn dress. Adrian moved towards a large fireplace, where a low fire crackled. The limp in his gait more pronounced now that the adrenaline of the public confrontation had faded. He didn't sit, but rested a hand on the marble mantelpiece, his broad back to her. "I am sorry for the abruptness of all this," he said, his voice softer now, the gravelly edge smoothed away. He turned to face her, and the weariness in his eyes seemed to have deepened. "I did not mean to frighten you." Selene found her voice, though it was a small, trembling thing. "I am not frightened of you," she whispered, and was surprised to find that it was the truth. She was terrified of the court, of her family, of this opulent cage, but not of him. His visible pain, his quiet dignity, the inexplicable connection she had felt when he took her hand, none of it inspired fear. He gave a small, sad smile. "You may be the only one in the kingdom who can say that." He gestured to a plush armchair near the fire. "Please, sit." She obeyed, perching on the very edge of the cushion, feeling as though she might soil the expensive fabric. He remained standing, watching her with an unnerving intensity. "They told me your name is Hart," he said, "but they did not give me a first name." "It's Selene," she said, her voice barely audible. "Selene," he repeated, tasting the name. It sounded different in his mouth, not the whisper her family used, but something solid, something real. "It's a beautiful name," he paused. "Tell me, Selene, why were you hiding?" The question was direct, and she flinched. She couldn't tell him the truth, that her family found her so worthless, they had locked her away like a piece of broken furniture. The shame was a hot, bitter thing in her throat. I do not care for crowds," she mumbled, staring at her hands. He was silent for a long moment, and she risked a glance up at him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but she sensed he did not believe her lie. Yet he did not press. Instead, a flicker of something, a shared understanding, passed through his eyes. Emboldened by his lack of judgment, a question rose in her own mind, a question born of the strange empathy she had felt for him in the great hall. Her courage, a tiny, newfound thing, pushed the words out before she could stop them. "And you?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Your leg, the war. Does it still cause you pain?" The moment the words were out, she wanted to snatch them back. It was an impertinent question, a question no one would dare ask a king. But Adrian didn't look angry, he looked surprised. He glanced down at his injured leg as if noticing it for the first time. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet and raw, with an honesty that stunned her. "It always does." He looked back at her, and the mask of the weary king fell away for just a second, revealing the man beneath. "I was dreading this night, Selene, this whole ridiculous ceremony. Being paraded around, having every ambitious family in the kingdom present their daughters, all of them looking at me with the same mixture of pity and greed. I felt like a damaged prize to be won." He confessed his relief at finding her, his voice dropping even lower. "You were the only one who wasn't looking at me at all. You weren't part of the game. You were just there, in the shadows. And when I saw you, I knew." As he spoke, he unconsciously raised a hand and touched the long, jagged scar on his face, a gesture of profound self-consciousness, a habit born from years of seeing revulsion in the eyes of others. The gesture was so vulnerable, so deeply human, that it broke through the last of Selena's fear. Without thinking, her own hand lifted. She didn't reach for his face, for the scar that defined him in the eyes of the world. Instead, she reached for the hand that bore the weight of his self-consciousness, her small, cool fingers gently touching the back of his. He froze at her touch, his cobalt eyes widening in surprise. He looked down at her small hand resting on his scarred one, and a shudder went through his massive frame. It was not a touch of pity, nor of ambition. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, of acceptance. In that moment, the fragile intimacy that had sparked between them began to weave itself into something stronger. He, the broken king, saw a kindness in her that he thought had been lost to the world. And she, the forgotten girl, saw the lonely, wounded man behind the crown. And in the quiet of the grand room, surrounded by the whispers of a scandalized court, two outsiders, bound by a fate neither had expected, began to find a sanctuary in each other. The fragile peace of their shared silence was broken the next morning by a sharp rap on the door. A woman entered, her spine as straight and unyielding as a steel rod, her silver hair pulled back into a bun so severe it seemed to pull the skin taut at her temples. She introduced herself as Madame Dubois, the head of the royal household, and more importantly, the arbiter of the queen's wardrobe. Selene was led to a vast dressing room, a chamber larger than the entire floor she had occupied in the Hart estate. It was lined with empty wardrobes of fragrant cedar and mirrors framed in gold leaf. Bolts of fabric, a king's ransom in silk, velvet, and brocade, were piled on tables. Their rich colors, a stark contrast to the world of gray and brown Selene had always known. Madame Dubois circled her, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. Her eyes, like chips of flint, missed nothing, from the worn hem of Selene's dress to her bare, unadorned neck. "We have a great deal of work to do," the woman announced, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "His Majesty has commanded a wardrobe befitting a queen, though with such a slight frame, it will be a challenge to create the necessary presence." The words were a series of tiny, sharp pricks against Selene's already frayed nerves. Two younger seamstresses scurried forward, their hands filled with measuring tapes and pins. Selene stood stiffly as they measured her, their hands cold and impersonal. She felt less like a person and more like an object to be draped and decorated. Madame Dubois held up a bolt of deep crimson silk, the color of blood and power. "This for the formal dinner tonight. It will give the illusion of substance." She then gestured to a tray of jewels brought forth by another attendant. Diamonds, rubies, and emeralds glittered with a cold, hard fire. "And these. A queen must not appear impoverished." Every word was a carefully chosen dart, meant to remind Selene of her inadequacy, of how far she was from the noble ladies who had been groomed for this role since birth. Selene looked at her reflection in the grand mirror. The girl staring back was a stranger, her pale face and wide, nervous eyes lost in the sea of opulent fabric they draped over her shoulders. The clothes felt alien, a costume for a part she didn't know how to play. The weight of the jewels they placed against her throat felt like a beautiful, glittering chain, pulling her deeper into this gilded cage. Her sense of being an imposter, a ghost who had accidentally wandered into the land of the living, solidified into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. That evening, the knot in her stomach tightened with every step she took towards the royal dining hall. The crimson gown, while exquisitely made, felt heavy and restrictive, the unfamiliar rustle of silk a constant reminder of her new, precarious position. Adrian stood beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. He had said nothing about her appearance, but the brief, appreciative glance he'd given her when she first entered the sitting room had been enough to give her a sliver of courage. The dining hall was smaller and more intimate than the grand hall of the ceremony, but no less intimidating. A long, polished table was set with gleaming silver and crystal, and the faces that turned to watch them enter were the most powerful in the kingdom. They were the members of Adrian's royal council, and their expressions ranged from cautious neutrality to thinly veiled hostility. Adrian took his seat at the head of the table, and Selene sat to his right, her back ramrod straight. The silence was deafening. Then a man seated across from her smiled, a slow, lazy smile that did not reach his eyes. He was devastatingly handsome, with hair the color of spun gold, and eyes a startling shade of green. He raised his goblet to her in a mock toast. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that slid over the skin like oiled silk. "Lord Valerius, at your service." Adrian's hand, which had been resting on the table, curled into a fist. "Valerius," he said, his tone clipped. "We were all so surprised by the events of the ceremony," Valerius continued, his gaze sweeping over Selene with an insolent appraisal. "It is truly refreshing to see the king choose a mate of such, shall we say, simple origins. It shows a certain humility that we have not seen at court in a great many years." The insult was wrapped in the finery of a compliment, but its sting was no less potent. He was calling her a peasant, a commoner, and by extension, he was calling the king a fool for choosing her. The other council members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Valerius, Selene, and the king. Selene felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to become the ghost her stepsisters had always called her. But then she saw the look in Adrian's eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous fire. "It shows that I value strength of character over a fancy name. Valerius," Adrian's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Something you would do well to remember." Valerius's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, my king. A noble sentiment. I am merely concerned with the stability of the kingdom. A queen with no alliances, no lineage, it can be a precarious position. He turned his venomous charm back to Selene. Tell me, Lady Selene, what is it that your family is known for? Land, trade, or perhaps some other particular skill? The implication was clear, and it was vile. Selene's mind went blank with a mixture of fury and humiliation. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was drowning in their judgment, and Valerius was watching her with the predatory satisfaction of a wolf cornering a lamb. But before the silence could condemn her, Adrian spoke again, his voice like the rumble of an avalanche. Her family is known for raising my mate, he stated, his words an irrefutable fact. And that is the only alliance I require. This discussion is over. The finality in his tone was absolute. The conversation at the table resumed, stilted and cautious, but the battle had been drawn. Selene looked at Adrian, at the hard line of his jaw, and the protective fury still burning in his cobalt eyes. She had felt the first real sting of court politics, the cold, sharp bite of its venom. She realized with a sinking heart that her new life would be a constant battle. But as she looked at the king who had so fiercely defended her, she also felt a flicker of something else, a fierce, unfamiliar surge of gratitude. She was not in this battle alone. Later that night, the vastness of the royal bedchambers seemed to amplify her loneliness. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Selene lay stiffly on her side of the enormous bed, the fine linen sheets cool against her skin. Adrian lay on his back beside her, a silent, imposing shape in the darkness. Sleep would not come. The events of the day, Madame Dubois' condescension, Lord Valerius's cruel words, replayed in her mind. She was an outsider, a pretender, and it was only a matter of time before they all realized it. She was startled from her anxious thoughts by a sudden guttural sound from Adrian. He began to move, his body thrashing against the sheets, his hands clenching and unclenching. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony. "No," he muttered, his voice thick with sleep and terror. "Hold the line. They're breaking through." He was having a nightmare. He was back in the war, back in the battle that had scarred his body and soul. Selene's heart went out to him. Her first instinct was to retreat, to pretend she was asleep, to not intrude on such a private, painful moment. She was afraid. But then she remembered the look in his eyes as he defended her at dinner, the unwavering strength he had shown on her behalf. Her compassion, a force stronger than her fear, pushed her into action. She hesitated for only a moment before she sat up and moved closer to him. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing, "you are safe. It's just a dream." He didn't wake, but his thrashing lessened slightly at the sound of her voice. He cried out again, a sharp, pained sound, and she saw the sweat beading on his brow in the faint moonlight. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed her cool palm against his forehead. At her touch, a shudder ran through him, but it was not one of revulsion. He leaned into her hand, a deep, ragged sigh escaping his lips, the sound of a man finding an anchor in a raging storm. The tension in his massive frame began to ebb away, the frantic movements ceasing. She kept her hand there, gently stroking his temple, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort until his breathing deepened and evened out, his body finally sinking into a true, peaceful sleep. She stayed like that for a long time, watching him in the quiet darkness. In this moment, he was not the broken king or the fearsome Alpha. He was just a man, haunted by demons she could only imagine. And in her simple act of comfort, Selene felt a profound shift within herself. Her compassion, the part of her that her family had always dismissed as weakness, had broken through his hardened exterior and given him peace. It was a powerful, humbling realization. She was not as helpless as she had always been led to believe. When the first gray light of dawn crept into the room, Adrian stirred. He opened his eyes and they immediately found hers. He remembered. She could see the memory of his vulnerability, of her touch, flash in his gaze, followed by a wave of deep, mortifying embarrassment. He sat up, turning away from her. the muscles in his back rigid with tension. "My apologies," he said, his voice rough. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You didn't," Selene said softly, sitting up as well. "I was awake." She looked at him, at the proud set of his shoulders, and saw the effort it took him to maintain his kingly composure. "You have nothing to apologize for." He didn't respond, but she saw him wince as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his hand instinctively going to his injured thigh. The nightmare had taken its toll, the phantom pains of his old wounds inflamed by the memory of their creation. "Your leg is worse this morning," she stated, not as a question, but as a simple observation. "It is nothing," he said, his voice tight with pain and pride. "I have the royal physicians for it." "I know," she said, and then, taking a leap of faith, she revealed a part of herself she had shared with no one. "My mother was a healer. She wasn't of noble blood, just a village woman, but she knew the old ways. She taught me about herbs, about remedies for pain." Adrian turned to look at her, his expression one of stunned surprise. This was a piece of her history that no one at court knew, a secret kept hidden along with Selene herself. "There is a poultice," she continued, her confidence growing as she spoke of something she understood. "Of comfrey and willow bark. It can help with the inflammation and the ache. Please, let me try." He stared at her, his cobalt eyes searching her face. He saw no pity there, only a quiet, earnest desire to help. He was a king, accustomed to giving orders, not to receiving care. Yet he was so very tired of the pain. After a long moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A wave of relief and purpose washed over Selene. She requested the herbs from a stunned-looking servant, and when they arrived, she set to work, crushing the leaves and bark with a practiced skill, mixing them with warm water to form a thick, fragrant paste. She returned to the bedside, the warm bowl in her hands. "You will have to," she began. Her voice faltering slightly, he understood. With a resigned sigh, he adjusted his position, exposing the scarred, knotted muscles of his thigh. The physician's examinations were clinical, impersonal. This felt different. This felt intimate. Selene knelt beside the bed. She hesitated for only a second before applying the warm poultice to his skin. He hissed in a sharp breath as the heat sank into his aching muscles. But then she did something more. Her fingers, gentle but firm, began to massage the tight, damaged tissue around the old wound, working with a skillful pressure that was both comforting and deeply therapeutic. Her touch was not one of revulsion at the scarred flesh, but of a healer seeking to soothe and mend. Adrian was utterly still, stunned into silence by her kindness, by her unexpected skill. He had been so focused on her perceived fragility, on her need for his protection. He had never imagined that she possessed a strength of her own, a quiet, healing power that he found he desperately needed. He closed his eyes, not against a nightmare this time, but in surrender to her touch. The pain in his leg began to recede, replaced by a spreading warmth that seemed to reach far deeper than the muscle, touching the cold, wounded parts of his soul. He was beginning to see her not as the frail girl from the shadows, but as a woman with a quiet fortitude that might just be the salvation of them both. The quiet care Selene offered was a balm Adrian hadn't realized his soul craved, a gentle dawn after a long, violent night. But the peace of the bedchamber could not hold back the realities of the kingdom. The whispers of the court were a constant, rustling tide, but soon they were drowned out by the more urgent and dangerous whispers of war. The news arrived with a mud-splattered messenger who burst into the king's council chamber, his chest heaving as he delivered a sealed dispatch. Selene had been seated on a modest bench along the wall, a silent observer as Adrian discussed trade routes with his advisors. She was a queen in name, but in this room of hardened, powerful men, she still felt like a ghost. The messenger's words fell like stones into the calm pool of the morning's agenda. A warlord from the bordering kingdom of Gyre, a ruthless man named Casimir, was massing troops at their northern border. He had sacked a border village, claiming it as ancient Gyran land, and was demanding fealty from the surrounding territories. A tense silence descended upon the chamber. Adrian's face, which had softened in the quiet moments with Selene, became a mask of granite. The scar on his cheek seemed to darken. a stark reminder of the price of conflict. The council erupted. "This is an act of war," declared a young, hot-headed lord named Marcus, his hand already on the hilt of his sword. "We must ride north and crush this dog before he gets any bolder." An older, more cautious general, a man named Borin, whose face was a roadmap of old campaigns, shook his head. "Casimir is no dog. He is a wolf, cunning and brutal. To rush in without a plan is to walk into a trap. The northern passes are treacherous." The chamber divided, voices rising in a cacophony of fear and bravado. Some urged for an immediate, aggressive response to show strength, while others counseled caution, diplomacy, and the slow gathering of their full might. Through it all, Lord Valerius sat back in his chair, a picture of calm amusement, his green eyes glittering. He waited for the arguments to reach a fever pitch before he spoke, his smooth voice cutting through the noise. "Perhaps General Borin is right to be cautious," he began, his words dripping with false concern. He glanced at Adrian, a flicker of a smirk on his handsome face. "A protracted war requires a leader at the peak of his strength. We must consider if our king is prepared for such a campaign. Casimir will not be defeated with half measures or a divided command." The insult was as sharp as a shard of glass. He was not just questioning Adrian's strategy, he was questioning his fitness to rule, suggesting that his injuries had made him weak, a liability in the face of a true threat. Selene saw Adrian's hand grip the carved arm of his throne, his knuckles turning white. The air crackled with tension. The fear in the room was no longer just of the warlord Casimir, but of their own king's perceived weakness. Adrian's gaze became distant, and Selene knew with a sickening certainty that he was no longer in the council chamber. He was back on a bloody battlefield, the scent of iron and death in his nostrils, the memory of the blow that had shattered his leg, a fresh, searing agony. He was torn between the crushing weight of his duty to protect his people and the deep, visceral fear of returning to the hell that had broken him. He felt the eyes of every man in the room on him, judging him, weighing him, and finding him wanting, feeling utterly useless, a decorative doll in a room where the fate of the kingdom was being decided. Selene slipped out of the chamber. The angry voices of the council faded behind her as she sought refuge in the one place in the palace that felt like a sanctuary, the royal library. The vast two-story room was silent, save for the gentle rustle of turning pages from a lone scribe in the corner. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax, a scent she found infinitely more comforting than the cloying perfumes of the court. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she could not bear to stand by and do nothing while Adrian carried such a heavy burden. She felt a desperate need to help, to contribute something more than a soothing touch or a comforting word. She began to pull down dusty tomes, her search initially aimless. She read about the history of Gyre, about the lineage of its kings, about past border skirmishes. The texts were dry, filled with names and dates that meant little to her, yet she persisted. Driven by a burgeoning sense of purpose, her sharp mind, so long left to languish, began to piece together the puzzle of the two kingdoms. Hours passed. The sun slanted low through the high arched windows, painting the library in hues of orange and gold. Her fingers were smudged with the dust of centuries, and her eyes ached from deciphering the faded script of ancient scrolls. She was about to give in to despair when she found it. It wasn't in a grand historical account, but in a dry, dense book of territorial laws and treaties. Tucked away in a chapter about marriage pacts from 3 centuries prior was a reference to the oath of perpetual kinship, an alliance sworn between the Blackthorne and Gyron royal lines to end a bloody decades-long war. A jolt of excitement shot through her. She frantically searched for more, her hands flying across the shelves. She found a corresponding scroll, its wax seal cracked with age, that detailed the oath. It was more than a simple non-aggression pact. It was a sworn bond of brotherhood, declaring that any who attacked one kingdom would be considered an enemy to both, and that the two lines would forever treat each other as blood kin. It was a detail everyone had forgotten, a piece of history buried under 300 years of shifting alliances and minor squabbles. She unrolled a massive, dusty map of the region from that era and saw that the village Casimir had taken was, in fact, Designated as a shared protectorate under the terms of the oath, it belonged to neither kingdom, but to the bond between them. She had found it, a weapon not of steel, but of history and honor. A sense of empowerment, fierce and exhilarating, surged through her. She was not just a healer, she was a scholar. She was not just a comfort, she was a strategist. She had found a way to fight. The next day, the mood in the castle was grim. Adrian, after a long and contentious debate, had decided to lead a diplomatic mission to the border himself. It was a risk, a move to show he was not afraid to face Casimir. But it left the court on edge. As he prepared to leave from the royal stables, Selene stood by, her discovery a secret she held close, waiting for the right moment. Adrian's war stallion, a magnificent black beast named Shadow, was being saddled. The horse was a creature of fire and spirit, loyal only to Adrian, and he pawed at the cobblestones, sensing the tension in the air. Lord Valerius was there, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a look of detached interest. Adrian moved to mount, his hand resting on the saddle. But as he put his weight in the stirrup, Shadow screamed, a sound of pure pain and terror. The massive stallion reared up, his front hooves lashing at the air, his eyes wide with panic. Grooms scattered as the horse bucked and kicked, trying to dislodge the saddle. Adrian, caught off guard, was thrown back, his injured leg twisting under him. He cried out in pain as he hit the ground, the stable yard erupting into chaos. While the guards rushed to help the king, and the stable master tried in vain to control the frantic horse, Selene moved. Her natural affinity for animals, a gentle empathy she had always possessed, overrode her fear. "Easy, boy," she said, her voice a low, calming murmur. "Easy now, let me see." She approached the terrified stallion slowly, her hands outstretched. The horse was still trembling, his sides heaving, but he seemed to respond to the quiet authority in her voice. He stopped his bucking, his wild eyes fixing on her. She reached him and ran a soothing hand along his neck, whispering to him, her touch gentle. Then her hand slid under the saddle blanket. She felt it instantly. A cluster of sharp, thorny burrs, deliberately and cruelly wedged deep into the fabric where it would press directly onto the horse's spine. It was not an accident. It was sabotage. A cold fury, unlike anything she had ever felt, washed through her. She pulled the burrs out, her fingers stained with a few drops of the stallion's blood. As she straightened up, her eyes lifted and met Lord Valerius's across the stable yard. He had not moved. His face was a mask of polite concern, but his green eyes held a glint of triumph. In that moment, she knew with a chilling, absolute certainty that he was responsible. He had not only tried to injure the king, but to humiliate him, to make him look like a weakling who could not even control his own horse. It was a silent declaration of war, and Selene accepted the challenge. Her protective instincts for Adrian, which had been a fragile seedling, bloomed into a fierce, unyielding force. The council was in an uproar. The incident in the stables was seen as a terrible omen, and Valerius was using it to his full advantage, arguing that the king was in no condition to lead, that his very presence seemed to invite disaster. The debate over their next move was raging more fiercely than ever when the doors to the chamber opened. Selene stepped inside. She was no longer the timid observer on the side bench. She walked with a newfound purpose, her head held high, a rolled scroll and an ancient map clutched in her hands. She walked directly to the foot of the council table, and the sheer force of her will commanded silence. "My lords," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "You debate whether to meet this threat with swords or with words. I propose you use a weapon you have forgotten you possess." She unrolled the ancient map on the table, its faded ink a stark contrast to the polished wood. 300 years ago, King Alaric Blackthorne, Adrian's ancestor, signed a treaty with King Theron of Gyre. It was called the Oath of Perpetual Kinship. She then unrolled the scroll, her voice gaining strength as she presented her findings, explaining the terms of the forgotten pact. The shared protectorate of the village, the sworn bond of brotherhood. "We do not need to declare war," she concluded, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the councilmen. "We need only to remind Casimir of the oath his own ancestors swore." We challenge his honor, not his army." A stunned silence followed. The council stared at her, then at the map, their minds struggling to process this completely unexpected strategy. Then a slow, mocking clap broke the silence. It was Lord Valerius. "Bravo!" he sneered, his lips curling. "A truly fascinating history lesson. But we are dealing with a warlord, not a scholar. He will laugh in your face." He turned to the council, his expression one of theatrical disbelief. "And who is this? The king's new historian?" The insult hung in the air, designed to dismiss her, to put her back in her place as an ignorant female. But before anyone could agree, Adrian's voice boomed through the chamber, filled with a power no one had heard from him since before the war. He had pushed himself to his feet, leaning on the table for support, but his eyes were blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with pain or fear. It was pride. It was awe. "She is your queen," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a hammer blow. "And you will listen to her." He looked at Selene, and in that moment, she was not the frail girl he had found in the shadows. She was a brilliant, fierce strategist, his partner, his equal. The awe and admiration in his eyes were more potent than any declaration of love. It was a turning point. The council, silenced by their king's command and genuinely intrigued by the novel strategy, looked at Selene with a newfound respect. She had not only saved Adrian from humiliation, she had offered the kingdom a path away from a bloody war. She had commanded the respect of the most powerful men in the land, not by wearing a crown, but by using her mind. And as she stood there, her heart swelling with a feeling she had never known before, a feeling of worth, of power, of belonging, she knew that she was no longer a ghost. She was a queen. The journey north was a tense affair, a procession of armored guards riding through a landscape that grew harsher with every league. The rolling green hills of the heartland gave way to rugged, windswept moors and forests of grim, skeletal pines. Adrian rode at the head of the column, his back a rigid line of defiance, the banner of the Blackthorne kingdom snapping in the cold wind. Selene rode beside him, her own apprehension a cold knot in her stomach, yet it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. She had armed him with a forgotten truth, and now she would stand with him as he wielded it. They met the warlord Casimir on a desolate, fog-shrouded plain that marked the contested border. Casimir's camp was not one of regal pavilions, but a grim, practical assembly of hide tents and sharpened wooden palisades, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Casimir himself was a bear of a man, with a wild black beard braided with silver rings and eyes that glittered with a predatory intelligence. He stood flanked by his champions, their faces scarred and their armor battered, a stark contrast to the polished steel of Adrian's royal guard. The air was thick with unspoken violence, a high-stakes negotiation where a single wrong word could unleash a torrent of blood. They met in a large, open-sided tent, a cold wind whipping at the heavy canvas walls. "The broken king," Casimir grunted, his voice a low rumble as he looked Adrian up and down, his gaze lingering with insolent appraisal on Adrian's scarred leg. "I had heard the stories, but I did not imagine they were so true. You come to my lands to parley, or to surrender." Adrian's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady, devoid of the anger Casimir was trying to provoke. "I come to your lands, Casimir, to remind you of who you are. You are the son of a line that swore an oath you seem to have forgotten." Following Selene's strategy, Adrian did not make threats or demands. He simply unrolled a precise copy of the ancient pact that Selene had discovered. He laid it on the rough-hewn table between them. "The oath of perpetual kinship," Adrian stated, his voice resonating with the weight of the history it held. "Sworn by our ancestors, sealed in blood and honor. This land you have taken is not yours to claim. It is a protectorate, a symbol of the bond between our kingdoms. By attacking it, you have not just stolen land. You have broken a sacred trust." Casimir stared at the document, his initial blustering arrogance giving way to a flicker of surprise, then a deep calculating frown. He was a warlord, but he was also a king, and the concept of ancestral honor was not something to be dismissed lightly among his people. He was taken aback, but also intrigued. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the table. "Ancient words on a brittle scroll," he scoffed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Words do not stop swords. My people are hungry. That village has fertile land my kingdom needs." "The oath provides for that," Adrian countered, his mind racing, recalling the details Selene had painstakingly explained to him. "It speaks of shared resources in times of hardship, of mutual support. It offers a path to prosperity through cooperation, not conquest, a path you have chosen to ignore." The warlord was still skeptical, his eyes narrowing as he tested Adrian's resolve. "Cooperation?" he sneered. "It sounds like the plea of a weak king who fears war." He stood up, towering over the table. "Perhaps I should take more than a village. Perhaps I should take your whole, broken kingdom." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Adrian's guards tensed, their hands moving to their swords, but Adrian did not flinch. He met the warlord's gaze, his own cobalt eyes holding a quiet, unyielding strength that had nothing to do with physical perfection. "My kingdom is not broken," he said, his voice low and clear. "It is healing, and it is led by a king who values honor above pride and peace above bloodshed. But do not mistake that for weakness. If you force my hand, you will find that the Blackthorne armies have not forgotten how to fight. The choice is yours, Casimir. Will you be remembered as the king who spat on the graves of his ancestors, or the one who was wise enough to honor their legacy and lead his people into a new era of prosperity?" He pushed the scroll across the table. "Read the words. The choice is yours." The tension was a physical thing, a high, keening note that stretched to the breaking point. Selene watched, her heart in her throat, as Casimir stared at Adrian, then down at the scroll. Finally, with a grunt, the warlord snatched up the document and began to read. The treaty was a success. Casimir, a man who respected strength, but also understood the power of tradition among his clans, had recognized the wisdom in Adrian's offer. A new pact was forged, one that honored the old oath while addressing the needs of his people. A feast was held in the great hall of the Blackthorne castle to celebrate, the air thick with relief and a newfound sense of optimism. Lords who had been calling for war now raised their goblets in toast to peace, and the court, for the first time, seemed to be united behind their king. Selene sat beside Adrian, the crimson of her gown a vibrant splash of color in the joyous hall. She felt a quiet sense of pride, but her gaze kept drifting to Lord Valerius. He was the perfect courtier, smiling and laughing, offering his own eloquent toast to the king's wisdom. But his eyes, when he thought no one was watching, were cold and flat, his smiles never quite reaching them. An inexplicable unease settled over her. As the feast wore on, a servant approached the king's place with a fresh flagon of his favorite deep red wine. Selene watched as Valerius, in a seemingly casual gesture, rose from his seat to speak with a lord standing near the king's table. As he passed behind Adrian's chair, he stumbled slightly, his hand brushing against the servant who held the flagon. He apologized with a charming smile, but Selene's eyes narrowed. It was too smooth, too practiced. A moment later, the servant filled Adrian's goblet. It was then that Selene caught it, a faint, almost imperceptible scent on the air, momentarily overriding the rich aromas of roasted meat and spiced wine. It was a smell she knew from her mother's warnings about the most dangerous plants in the forest, the faint, sweet almond-like scent of crushed nightshade berries, a rare and deadly poison. Her blood ran cold, her eyes darted to Valerius. He was watching Adrian, his handsome face a mask of eager anticipation, a predator waiting for his prey to fall into the trap. Adrian, deep in conversation with General Boren, laughed at something the old soldier said and reached for his goblet. Time seemed to slow down. The laughter, the music, the flickering candlelight, all of it faded into a terrifying, silent tableau. Adrian's fingers were inches from the silver cup. Selene's mind screamed, but her voice was trapped in her throat. She had to act. In one fluid, desperate motion, she lunged, her hand shooting out. "Oh, forgive me," she cried, her voice high with feigned clumsiness. Her hand connected with Adrian's arm, and he jolted in surprise. Her momentum carried through, her other hand accidentally striking the base of the silver goblet. The cup flew from the table, its contents arcing through the air, a spray of dark red wine that spattered across the white marble floor like a splash of blood. A collective gasp went through the hall. The music screeched to a halt. All eyes turned to them, to the spreading stain on the floor and the king's shocked face. In the stunned silence that followed, Selene's heart hammered against her ribs. Adrian stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Selene, what?" he began. But before he could finish, Selene stood up, her entire body trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Lord Valerius. "He poisoned the king," she announced, her voice ringing with absolute certainty in the silent hall. The accusation was so audacious, so scandalous, that for a moment no one moved. Then Valerius burst into laughter, a sound that was sharp and brittle. "The queen is overwrought," he declared, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Her simple origins have clearly not prepared her for the pressures of the court. Perhaps she has had too much wine herself." "I am not drunk," Selene said, her voice dropping, gaining a chilling intensity. "And I am not mistaken. When you stumbled behind the king's chair, you dropped a pellet of poison into the flagon. I smelled it when the wine was poured. Nightshade. It has a scent like bitter almonds." She took a step towards him, her eyes never leaving his. "You thought I was just a simple girl, a ghost you could see right through. But I see more than you know. I see the poison on the cuff of your sleeve, a faint dusting of powder you were too arrogant to notice." All eyes flew to Valerius's cuff, and he instinctively tried to hide his hand. A fatal mistake. "And I know," Selene continued, her voice relentless, "that a man who handles such a poison would never be without the antidote. Check his coat. In a hidden pocket, you will find a small vial." Valerius's face had gone from mocking to ashen. Cornered and desperate, he turned on her, his handsome features twisting into a mask of pure venom. "She is a witch," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She deals in poisons and potions. She has enchanted the king with her dark arts. Seize her." But no one moved to seize her. They were all looking at Adrian. The king had risen slowly to his feet. The confusion was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of such cold, terrifying fury that the very air in the hall seemed to grow thin and cold. His gaze was fixed on Valerius, and the look in his eyes promised a death far slower and more painful than any poison. "Guards!" Adrian's voice was like the grinding of glaciers, an unstoppable, crushing force. "Search him." Two of the royal guard seized the struggling, protesting Valerius. They found the faint traces of white powder on his cuff, and from a cleverly hidden pocket inside his velvet coat, they produced a small corked vial filled with a clear liquid, the antidote. The proof was absolute, undeniable. A wave of shock and horror rolled through the court. Valerius, the charming, ambitious lord, was a traitor and an assassin. Adrian's face was like thunder. He looked at the man who had been his rival, who had served on his council, and who had just tried to murder him in front of his entire court. "Take this traitor to the dungeons," he commanded, his voice shaking with rage. "He will await my judgment." As the guards dragged the now whimpering Valerius from the hall, a new silence fell, but this one was different. It was a silence of awe. The court turned as one to look at Selene, no longer with pity or scorn, but with a deep, profound, and genuine respect. She had not only saved the king's life, she had unmasked a traitor with a wisdom and courage that no one, least of all her, had known she possessed. Later that night, the royal quarters were silent. The echoes of the feast's dramatic end finally faded. Adrian stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit kingdom, but seeing nothing. He was shaken, not by the attempt on his life, but by the casual, smiling betrayal of a man who had eaten at his table and advised his counsel. The world he knew, a world of shifting alliances and political maneuvering, suddenly felt like a nest of vipers. He heard a soft footstep behind him and turned. Selene stood there, her crimson gown shed in favor of a simple nightdress, her face pale, but her eyes clear and steady. An overwhelming wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Love, gratitude, awe. He had chosen her in the shadows, because his soul recognized hers, but he had never imagined the depth of her strength, the sharpness of her mind, the ferocity of her spirit. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't let him hurt you," she whispered, her own voice trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had gone. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his limp more pronounced in his haste. He took her hands in his grip firm, anchoring. "It's more than that, Selene," he said, his cobalt eyes searching hers. "Today in that council chamber, you gave me a weapon of peace when all they could offer was war. Tonight, you saw a truth that no one else could see. You are not just my mate." His voice broke for a moment. "You are my strength. You are my champion. You are the true heart of this kingdom." And then, he did something that shattered every protocol, every tradition of his rank. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorne, the ruler of the entire kingdom, slowly, deliberately knelt before her. The pain it cost his injured leg was evident in the tight line of his jaw, but he did it anyway, lowering himself to one knee on the cold stone floor. He bowed his head and pressed his forehead to their joined hands. "I pledge my life to you, Selene," he vowed, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "My sword, my crown, my soul, they are all yours. You saved me from the shadows, and I will spend the rest of my days honoring you." Tears streamed down Selene's face, tears not of fear or sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. The forgotten girl, the family ghost, the frail creature locked away in the dark, was being knelt to by her king. He looked up at her, his scarred face illuminated by the moonlight, and she saw no brokenness there. Only a love so fierce and complete, it healed every wound she had ever suffered. She knelt with him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and in the quiet of the chamber, their bond, forged in shadows and scandal, was finally sealed, not by fate, but by a love that was stronger than any poison, more powerful than any army, and more enduring than any kingdom. It was unbreakable. The throne room was a place of judgment the following morning. The joyous celebratory air of the previous night's feast had been scoured away, replaced by a heavy, solemn silence. The lords and ladies of the court stood assembled, their faces grim, their gazes fixed on the 2 figures brought before the throne. Lord Valerius was first. He was no longer the handsome, preening courtier in silks and velvets. He was dressed in a simple, rough-spun tunic. His hands bound before him, the arrogance had been stripped from him, leaving behind a hollow, desperate man whose eyes darted around the room, searching for a pity that he could not find. Adrian sat upon the throne, his face a mask of cold justice, but it was Selene, seated on a slightly smaller yet equally ornate throne beside him, who held the court's rapt attention. Adrian's voice was devoid of heat, a flat, hard tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "Lord Valerius, you have been found guilty of high treason, of the attempted murder of your king, and of endangering the queen. You used your position of trust to sow discord and pursue power through the most cowardly of means. Have you anything to say before your sentence is passed?" Valerius fell to his knees, the sound echoing in the vast chamber. "Mercy, your majesty," he begged, his voice a pathetic whine. "I was blinded by ambition. I was a fool. I beg for your mercy." Adrian looked at him, his expression unmoved. "You showed no mercy when you sabotaged my horse, hoping to see me crippled further or killed. You showed no mercy when you poured poison into my cup. The mercy you receive is that you will be allowed to live." A collective sigh of relief went through Valerius, but it was premature. "You will be stripped of your titles, your lands, and your name," Adrian continued, his voice like chipping stone. "You will be exiled to the Iron Isles, to live out your days in the salt mines. You will be forgotten. Your name will be struck from every record. You will cease to exist." The sentence was worse than death. It was erasure. Valerius collapsed, sobbing. As guards hauled him away, his pleas for a quick death ignored. The court watched, their faces pale, Justice had been served. Then the great doors opened again, and Lady Alara, Briar, and Thorn were escorted in. They were not bound, but the fear on their faces was a prison in itself. They stared at Selene, the girl they had tormented and locked away, now seated on a throne, a circlet of silver on her brow, the queen of the entire kingdom. They expected retribution, a vengeful fury to match their years of cruelty. They knelt, their bodies trembling, their fine gowns looking absurd in the face of their abject terror. Adrian looked to Selene. "My queen," he said, his voice softening for her alone, yet loud enough for all to hear. "Their fate is in your hands." All eyes turned to Selene. A lifetime of bitterness, of being made to feel worthless, of cold neglect and sharp, cruel words, rose within her. She could banish them. She could have them thrown in the same dungeons they had locked her in. The power was hers. She looked at their terrified faces, at her stepmother who had never shown her an ounce of affection, at her stepsisters who had treated her as less than human, and she felt nothing. The anger was gone, burned away by the far brighter fires of love and purpose. Vengeance felt small, a petty, unsatisfying thing. She rose from her throne, the soft rustle of her gown the only sound in the hall. She descended the steps and stood before them. "You locked me away because you were ashamed of me," Selene said, her voice not angry but clear and steady, a voice of quiet authority. "You feared I would bring shame upon our name. Instead, you brought it upon yourselves." She looked at Lady Alara. "You taught me that love was conditional and that family was a weapon. I will not continue that lesson." She then looked at Briar and Thorn. "You taught me that kindness was weakness and that cruelty was a sport. You were wrong." She took a deep breath. "I will not seek revenge. The cycle of bitterness in our family ends today. You will be sent to the Hart family's northernmost estate, a quiet manor by the sea. You will live there comfortably, but you will hold no power, attend no court, and have no say in the affairs of this kingdom or any other. You will have time to reflect on your actions. That is my judgment." A stunned silence met her words. Lady Alara looked up, her face a mask of disbelief. She had expected a prison, or exile, or worse. She was being given a quiet, comfortable life. It was a mercy so profound, so unexpected. It was more shaming than any punishment. Selene had not lowered herself to their level. She had risen above it, so far above it that they could barely comprehend her position. She had become a compassionate and just ruler. As she turned and ascended the steps back to her throne, the court looked at her with a new, deeper admiration. She was not just the king's choice. She was the kingdom's conscience. In the weeks that followed, a quiet peace settled over the palace. The court, having witnessed Selene's wisdom and Adrian's unwavering support for her, fell into a new order, one based on respect rather than fear. One afternoon, Adrian found Selene in the palace's glass garden, a vast conservatory filled with exotic plants and the gentle sound of trickling fountains. She was tending to a bed of pale, moon-white roses, her fingers gentle on their petals. He came up behind her, his limp barely noticeable on the soft, mossy ground, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his embrace, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips. They stood like that for a long time, simply breathing together, surrounded by the quiet, growing life of the garden. "Do you remember the first night?" Adrian said softly, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "When you asked me if my legs still caused me pain?" "I remember," she whispered. "I was afraid I had offended you." "You did the opposite," he said. He turned her in his arms to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "No one had ever asked me that." They either ignored it or stared at it. They saw the injury, the scar, the limp. They saw a broken king. His cobalt eyes were filled with a deep, peaceful intimacy. "My physical scars remain, Selene. They will always be a part of me, but the wounds in my heart, the ones that festered in the dark for so long, they have begun to heal, and that is because of you." He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You did not just save my life in that dining hall. You saved my soul, right from the very beginning. You looked at me, and you did not see a cripple. You saw a man in pain, and you offered comfort. You offered kindness without wanting anything in return. You healed the part of me that believed I was unworthy of being loved. Tears welled in Selena's eyes, glittering like diamonds in the dappled sunlight of the garden. And you saw me when no one else did, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I was a ghost, a creature of dust and shadows. I had been told I was worthless for so long that I believed it. But you looked into the darkness and you found me. You pulled me into the light. They had found in each other something far more profound than a fated bond. It was a true partnership of equals, a love built not on perfection, but on the gentle, courageous acceptance of their shared brokenness. They were two halves of a whole, not because fate demanded it, but because they had chosen to heal each other. 1 year later, the grand hall was once again filled to capacity. The occasion was another grand ceremony, but this time it was not to choose a mate, but to celebrate the first anniversary of their union, and a year of unprecedented peace and prosperity for the kingdom. The atmosphere was utterly transformed from that first, tense, mating ceremony. The hall was filled with genuine joy, with warmth and light and laughter. The heavy, imposing tapestries had been replaced with ones depicting scenes of harvest and celebration, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers instead of cloying perfume. Adrian stood with Selene, greeting their guests. He no longer stood with the rigid, defensive posture of a man expecting judgment. He was relaxed, smiling, his hand resting possessively on the small of Selene's back. His limp was still there, a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He moved with a confidence that came not from a lack of weakness, but from an acceptance of it. Selene, for her part, was radiant. She wore a gown of deep blue, the color of Adrian's eyes, and she moved through the crowd with a quiet grace and confidence that was entirely her own. She was no longer the frightened girl playing dress up. She was a queen, beloved by her people, respected by her court, and adored by her king. They were a team, their movements synchronized, their smiles reflecting in each other's eyes. As the celebration reached its peak, Adrian led Selene from the warm, noisy hall and out onto the grand balcony overlooking the capital city. The cool night air was a welcome relief. Below them, the city lights twinkled like a fallen constellation, and from the peaceful, orderly streets, the faint sounds of music and celebration drifted up to them. They stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the kingdom they had healed together. He was no longer the disabled Alpha King, a title whispered with pity and scorn. He was Adrian Blackthorne, a strong and beloved ruler who had brought peace and a new alliance to his people. And she was no longer the forgotten girl, the Hart family's shameful secret. She was Queen Selene, the healer, the strategist, the king's champion. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, familiar gesture that still sent a jolt of warmth through her. They turned to look at each other, their love story, which had begun in scandal and shadow, now a legend that would be told for generations. It was a story of how a broken king and a forgotten girl had found each other, and in doing so, had found themselves. It was a testament to the idea that true strength is found not in the absence of flaws, but in the courage to love and heal the broken parts of ourselves and each other. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss, filled with the promise of a long and happy life together. They had not only healed each other, they had healed their kingdom, building a future that was brighter and more hopeful than either of them had ever dared to imagine. And as they stood on the balcony, hand in hand, silhouetted against the moon, they were not just a king and queen. They were a symbol of hope, a promise that even from the deepest shadows, the brightest light can emerge.